Hello everyone. Let's get a quick confirmation that the audio is good and then we will proceed. How are we all tonight? So as you can see, our friend Endeavor has been at it again. This one's going to be slightly different. Normally, when I respond to these things, I've watched them through at least once. I'm going through this one a little bit blind. But hopefully that won't put us at too much of a disadvantage. Oh, without further ado, let's not take all night doing this. Let's begin.
Hello, Endeavor here.
Hi, Endeavor.
So I decided I wanted to add another addition into my series, Lies of the Enlightenment. In this video, I'm going to look at several Enlightenment ideas which pertain to serving the public good. I want to take on the idea that emerged from the Enlightenment that liberal democracy is the least corrupt form of government which serves the public interest the best. First, I want to look at two influential Enlightenment texts which pertain to this issue. The first text I want to look at is The Spirit of the Laws by Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu classifies three types of political regimes: republican states, monarchical states, and despotic states. A despotic state is one in which the ruler rules uninhibited by any restraints upon their power. A monarchy is ruled by a single person who is beholden to established laws, while a republic is governed by either a small number of the public, making it an aristocracy, or the entire citizenry, making it a democracy. Montesquieu argues that despotic states are governed by the principle of fear, the fear instilled in the populace of the despot. Monarchical states are governed by the principle of honor, their pursuit of greater prestige, and republics are ruled by the principle of virtue, the pursuit of the public good. He argues that a republic must take the common good into account to survive, more so if it is democratic rather than aristocratic, while despotic or monarchical regimes do not. Montesquieu also argues for the separation of political power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. He argues that one entity, a monarch or a group of people controlling more than one branch, would result in the loss of the liberty of the subjects. If the three branches were occupied by separate entities, one entity which tried to infringe upon the liberty of the subjects would be counterbalanced by the other two, which would keep the rogue branch in check. The other text I'm going to look at is The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in particular his concept of the general will. Rousseau argues that a democratic republic in which the citizenry vote upon the laws which they are governed by is the best way to attain the public good. He argues that the will of the individual is always for their own good, but the good of an individual might not always be the same as the good of the public. So a system in which the citizens govern themselves, the general will, that being the collective will of the populace, will always be for the greatest good. Rousseau goes so far as to say that a republic is the only legitimate form of government. He argues that the general will, when adequately informed, is always good, and says that direct democracy rather than only representative democracy is the best way to achieve this. However, he concedes that direct democracy would be impossible in a state of millions of people and settles for representative democracy. Basically, the idea is that the public good is best served by the abolition of all hereditary rule and its replacement with representatives elected by the citizenry, and a division of power between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. These ideas were greatly influential on the French Revolution, which brought about the destruction of the old aristocratic order in France and ushered in the new liberal tradition.
Okay, I don't actually have a whole lot to weigh in on that. Why does this guy not have pants? Should look into that. So I mean, this doesn't seem that terrible. I think he's probably simplifying a little bit. It's a little bit interesting that he's specifically identifying the general will with voting, because that's not strictly speaking the case. The general will is a principle of sort of the ontology of sovereignty. It's not sort of a I don't know what you want to call it, like sort of a normative, it's not like a normative ideal, it's a part of his explanation of how a state functions. It's essentially his rendition of the social contract. The idea that the sovereign has the right to govern you because the sovereign governs by your consent to be governed, which is sort of tacitly implied by your taking part in the goods of the state, right? But I mean, otherwise, I'm surprised I don't have too much of an issue with this. I'm a little bit sus that he's suddenly bringing up Montesquieu. I don't think he's ever referenced Montesquieu in the past. I don't deny. I'm not going to doubt that he's actually read a little bit of him. But if anybody's seen a copy of The Spirit of the Laws, you're looking at something like Bible length. It's ridiculous. Anyways,
France and ushered in the new liberal tradition. Liberal democracy emerged in countries like France, the UK, and the United States following the Enlightenment era. But the system became the global norm during the 20th century with the destruction of the old aristocratic order following the First World War, the destruction of fascism following the Second World War, and the destruction of communism following the Cold War. While liberal democracy isn't a universal today, it's pretty close. The only countries in the world that don't claim to be democracies are Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, the UAE, Brunei, and Vatican City. Even China and North Korea at least claim to be democratic, even though that's obviously not true.
okay, North Korea is kind of a special case, but I don't think it's actually untrue to talk about China as being democratic. It's not a liberal society, but democratic doesn't mean what we think of as liberal democracy, right? It doesn't necessarily mean a community in which liberal values obtain or in which special human rights obtain. All democracy means, and it's in the word, democratic, right? It means that power is seated in the demos, which is a particular formation of the people such that they are broken up into geographic constituencies as opposed to tribal affiliations. It's all that means. All it means is that that is where power is seated. And as far as I can tell, that does seem to be the case in China. That doesn't mean voting, necessarily. It refers to, again, the seat of power, not to the form of government.
In the 21st century, the consensus around the world is that this is the only legitimate form of government. And I need to note, as always, that I'm going to look at these ideas as they're understood today, not necessarily how they were understood in the past. The first thing I want to do is look at the state of Western liberal regimes today and dispel the idea that liberal democracy necessarily serves the public good. First of all, the idea that it serves the general will. I'll link you to a video by Alternative Hypothesis which shows just how little influence public opinion has on policy in the United States. He goes over a study which shows that the likelihood of policies being passed is greatly influenced by elite support or lobbying, but middle class support has almost no influence at all. He also compares it to another study of public opinion in non-democratic regimes. He finds that public opinion is actually more influential on policy in authoritarian regimes than in the liberal democratic United States. So the idea that America is governed by the general will is completely false.
Okay, so there's two things going on here. First of all, I do actually want to look at this all-type video now because I'm curious about what it's actually arguing. I don't necessarily recommend all-type generally, I'm just curious. In terms of serving the general will, again, I think there's a bit of a misconstrual here. So how I like to characterize it when I'm talking to people trying to explain Rousseau is that it's the general will and not the general wish. So critically, think about it in terms of yourself, right? You have all sorts of things that you want to do. Maybe you want to get fit. Maybe you want to diet. Maybe you want to write a book. Maybe you want to read a really difficult book. You want to do those things really, really badly. Maybe that's the thing you want to do the most. However, you get onto the exercise machine, you do a few, I don't know what you call it, like movements on the exercise bike or whatever, and suddenly you get tired. It hurts. It feels super uncomfortable. And now all of a sudden, you find that despite the fact that you really want to get fit and you really want to exercise, you don't have the will to do it. So, in the case of the general will, it's very similar. The general will ultimately refers to what the community does. What the community wills to do, quite literally. So the general will, it's not necessarily, it's not fulfilled by, things like voting or by liberal democracy. However, it is best instantiated or it is, perhaps it's more accurate to say it is most instantiated in democracy, where the generality partake in politics. You sort of like made the general will as general as possible, if that makes sense. Or as general, how to put this? You've aligned the will with the general wish. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Secondly, the idea that liberal democracy puts public interest over private interest. Throughout their entire histories as liberal regimes, both the United States and the United Kingdom have had enormous wealth gaps between the rich and the poor. The size of the gap between the rich and the poor has fluctuated over time, but since the 1970s, it has sharply increased, with more and more wealth being concentrated in the top 1% richest. In the past year, the gap between the rich and the poor has gotten way bigger. With the COVID scam, there was a huge transfer of wealth from the middle class to the elites. Though it's probably hard to get an accurate picture of this, some sources I've seen have suggested that income inequality in the United States or Britain today is greater than France in the 18th century under absolutism.
That's of course historically. Oh well, no, we have to be careful here. That's not historically preposterous. That's sort of a misunderstanding of the nature of the disparity, right? So the gap between the rich and the poor today is bigger than it's ever been, but that's more to do with the insane amount of wealth that the wealthy have today compared to back then. Your average low income worker in the United States or in Canada or in the UK or wherever is nowhere near as poor as lower income earners in pre-revolutionary France. Again, there's a reason why a revolution happened.
So the idea that representative liberal democracy ensures that a regime will put public interest above private interest is also false. Lastly, the idea that this system gives the citizenry liberty. After this past year, this should just be patently false. These liberal regimes, with their division of power, have effectively confined their entire citizenry to their homes for an entire year.
And again, this is absurd. The existence of, or I guess the implementation of a state of emergency, which happens all the time. Like, if the most liberal democracy goes into a state of war, it may need to mobilize its citizenry for the sake of its continued existence. I mean, again, like, these ordinances are about preserving the lives and the liberty of its citizens. And again, like, the general will refers ultimately to what the state does. It refers to what the community ends up willing. So, in this case, again, like, to the extent that the community did in fact go along with this, that is the instantiation of the general will. Like, this is an important distinction, because the way in which the general will can be deployed to justify revolution is specifically because it's putting the stamp of validity on the decision of the people to restructure the state and who rules and who belongs to the state, even.
And they're now capable of controlling every aspect of their lives. No monarch has ever had this amount of power. It doesn't matter how much you divide power, a decentralized system is just as capable, and in fact I'd argue more capable, of taking away people's liberties as any system where power is centralized.
And again, like, power is very much centralized in even modern liberal democracies. There is a division of powers, but fundamentally, every single state has a constitutional allowance for the executive power to take full control in a state of emergency. And that's the site of sovereignty. So to a certain extent, the division of powers is a little bit farcical, because it doesn't actually refer to a division of powers, but to a division of, shall we say, to a division of, what's the word I'm looking for? I lost it. But like a division of purviews sort of underneath the sovereign power, if that makes sense. So within the state, the legislative branch is the authoritative element when it comes to fulfilling the law. The executive branch within the state has the ultimate decision in a context with respect to things like war or internal security or like a host of other things like that. But ultimately, the sovereign itself stands apart from all of that definitionally. that is ultimately the element of government that is able to, or the element of rule, I should say, that is able to adjust pragmatically and arbitrarily to deal with exigencies in real time. And again, that exists in every single state. And to the extent that states have attempted to obscure this, they've typically dissolved in very bad ways. Weimar is a paradigmatic case.
So liberal democracy in its current incarnation in the West today certainly does not serve the public good. So how can the public's interest be best served? Before I look into this, I need to establish that all regimes are hierarchical. That's just how human societies develop. I don't fault the liberal West for being elite-driven because all societies are elite-driven. I don't think equality is attainable or really even desirable, though the gargantuan gaps between the rich and the poor which exist today are of course undesirable. Hierarchy is healthy. Secondly, the public good is not the short-term gratification of the greatest number of individuals. The public good is the long-term health of the collective. This requires the state to act intergenerationally. Short-term prosperity at the expense of long-term societal stability is not serving the public good. So individualism must be dismissed. The long-term health of the collective must be the ultimate goal of the polity. Thirdly, we must dismiss...
Okay, but like this is what individualism is originally invoked to argue. The point to it, the reason why Hobbes inaugurates a specifically atomistic, individually rooted grounding for sovereignty isn't because he just loved individual anarchic freedom so much. It's because the argument goes that again, like the rule of the sovereign over you is in fact an enactment of your freedom, and for your own good, as you have recognized and you have shown that you have recognized by your being willing to partake in the goods secured by the existence of the sovereign power. Again, like he's writing in the context of the English Civil War. So yeah.
Dismiss the notion of universalism. The idea that there's a universal human good which the state can and should serve. This is false. Different groups exist and they have...
Hang on, I didn't catch that. The idea that...
The collective must be the ultimate goal of the polity. Thirdly, we must dismiss the notion of universalism. The idea that there's a universal human good which the state can and should serve. This is false.
Okay, is he going to provide an argument for that? That's a really deep metaphysical question. I'm really curious about what he has to say here.
Different groups exist and they have different interests which often conflict with each other. The goal of the state should be to serve the interests of the group which makes up its core population.
Which makes up its core population? What does that mean? What is its core population? It's just white people, isn't it? Is that where this is going? I mean, like, again, like the liberal conception of the state, again, beginning with Hobbes, is specifically that the state's legitimacy derives from the fact that it is a product of a contract to which we tacitly engage by enjoying the benefits of the state. So that would include that makes no distinctions between sort of like center or periphery or a core population, if you will. No, it's or even between I don't know, a majority in terms of ideological persuasion within the state. The state's legitimacy derives from the fact that it is an emanation from the will of every single citizen in it. I don't know where he's getting this idea of it should serve the core population. I don't know where the normative claim is coming from in any case. Maybe he'll elaborate.
Sacrificing the interests of this foundational group in pursuit of some universalist goal is both delusional and amoral. With this in mind, to understand what's wrong with liberalism today, I think the best place to look is way back at none other than the greatest of all Western philosophers,
Okay, so we're going into my territory now. Um, okay, so this is sort of a veiled criticism, obviously, of allowing what he would call mass immigration. So what he's arguing essentially is that the state has a moral duty to protect. I would presume he has in mind an ethnic core. But he just says this, so there's no argument here, and it's delusional and immoral for some reason. He says amoral, weirdly, which I agree it is amoral, but that makes it sort of pointless as a critique. That's just a statement of fact.
Aristotle. In his book, Politics, Aristotle classifies 6 different types of constitutions of states, 3 being virtuous, 3 being corrupt. Monarchy, ruled by one man, aristocracy, ruled by few, and polity, ruled by many, are the virtuous regimes. When corrupted, monarchy becomes tyranny, aristocracy becomes oligarchy, and polity becomes democracy. Now, it's vital to understand what the Greeks meant when they said someone was a tyrant. Today, our political science is so bad that it's commonplace for the mainstream to assign the word tyranny to any system other than liberal democracy. That's not what the Greeks meant when they said tyranny. A tyrant was a usurper who had come to power through unconstitutional means. This is not the same thing as monarchy. A monarch inherited his rule through legitimate succession in a royal family, while...
Okay, so he's so close. He's actually doing pretty good so far. But it's in the name, and we're actually in luck here because it's actually, the Greek is actually in the name itself. Monarchy. Monarchy doesn't refer to how the person came into power. The distinction here is not between a tyrant and a monarch, but a tyrant and what we would translate as a king or an archon. So archon simply refers to the head, to like it's a patriarchal ruler, not really directly equivalent to king, but it's like, for example, Achilles is an archon, Agamemnon is a greater archon. Monarchy just means one archon. That's all it means, just one king. Again, like a monarch can absolutely be tyrannical. The difference is that an archon is selected for his role by religious right, or if we want to extrapolate from Greece, by cultural right or by convention or something. The point is, again, like, it's legitimacy through tradition, as opposed to the tyrant who comes into power typically through force. And again, like, he's right to point out that not everything that isn't liberal democracy is tyranny. In fact, democracy itself comes about specifically by the activities of tyrants. Now, again, there are reasons why they're able to do this, because the common people were treated horribly. But yeah, so we actually owe our concept of democracy, and indeed the really, like, almost all of our terms of art in basic political science, to the activities of tyrants. People like Cleisthenes. I can never pronounce his name right, but Pisistratus. But yeah.
While a tyrant simply took his rule by force. Likewise, an aristocracy is not the same thing as an oligarchy. An aristocracy is ruled by the best. This would often be a nobility or those determined to be the wisest and most fit to rule. An oligarchy is simply ruled by the rich. And it's important to understand that this is not the same thing. While aristocrats almost always are the richest people in society, they also have the qualifications of nobility or virtue. For oligarchs, their only claim to power is that they are rich. What Aristotle referred to as democracy is also different than the way we use the term today. He referred to direct democracy, where the entire citizenry votes upon decisions, rather than representative democracy. In contrast, a polity or constitutional government was a mix between a democracy and an aristocracy, where voting rights were limited to some degree, which made those voting more qualified.
Okay, so this is an incorrect cliche. This is where I'm going to plug Clifford Bates's book, The Best Regime. So, when we read polity in Aristotle's Politics, what we're reading is actually a compromise with what seems to be a confusing redundancy in the text. So, when Aristotle is talking about the different regime types, he talks about the politeia called politeia. That's the word we translate as constitution, often. For example, Plato's Republic is technically called the politeia in its original Greek. Now, there's debate as to how it is best to translate this. Certain versions will render it as regime. Some will render it as the mixed regime. Some will render it as polity, as kind of this indeterminate sort of political sounding word that doesn't actually mean a whole lot. When somebody says polity, it means they don't really know what they're talking about or what they're referring to. They just think it has some element of political coherence about it, and that's just a way to not have to engage with that problem when you're identifying it as a part of a description of a political issue. What Bates argues, and what I find very compelling, is that actually what we should be doing is reading politeia as politeia, the politeia called politeia, and that seems to actually make the most sense of the text. And I think there's been a lot of positive uptake on that interpretation. So what that means is, what is the politeia qua the politeia? That is to say, what is the configuration of the community such that it is barely describable as a politeia? Right? Like, what's the one thing that all of these different politeias have in common? What is the thing that makes them politeias? And it is this. It's not a mixed one. And it is inherently democratic, because, again, it takes its divisions and its structure from these innovations by these reconstituting tyrants. Which is not to say, again, that it necessarily involves mass voting or liberal values. All it means is that it is, in fact, all political science presumes this, because this is the only way you can have a political science, when you're not simply talking about an anthropology of tribal rule, is, again, a restructuring of society in which the people are divided along geographic lines so that their identity as a community, as a political community, supersedes their identity as a part of a tribe. And their interest now starts to be associated with their daimoi, with the division in which they are. We might equivocate that with a province or a state, within the context of the United States, of course, or a municipality, what have you. But your interest now is tied to your region or to your immediate community and not to your tribal affiliations. And because that's the case, you can now reorganize society at every level because it's all just arbitrarily divided. It doesn't rely on these long genealogical histories to justify where things are. Things are where they are because it has been decided that they will go there. And that's why you can have political philosophy and you can ask questions about what is the best way to organize a community. Because you don't ask that question if the reason why the community exists is because of the rule of specific tribes that have been there since the dawn of time, right?
Aristotle considered polity to be the most stable regime as it was the least likely to devolve. What Aristotle considers to be the most important factor in governing a healthy state is not necessarily the kind of government, but that those in power have virtue. For Aristotle, if a monarch is virtuous, then monarchy is the best form of government. But he also asserts that tyranny, where the ruler is not virtuous, is the worst. Aristocracy is the next best if the aristocrats are virtuous, but oligarchy is the second worst if the few who do rule are not virtuous. Polity is the third best of the virtuous regimes, while democracy is the least terrible of the corrupt regimes. But what's most important is that those in power are virtuous and rule for the public interest. This is an important insight because it's something that our modern political science seems incapable of understanding. Because the Enlightenment conception of man is that he's a rational individual motivated only by his own material self-interest. Therefore, the assumption is that a leader with great or even absolute power will necessarily use it to enrich himself at the expense of the public.
Okay, so I think this sort of misunderstands the distinction between ancient political philosophy and modern political philosophy. So, critically, in ancient political philosophy, Again, like it's impoverished in a certain sense because this is sort of where it all begins. But in ancient political philosophy, you have it's political philosophy first of all, not political science. Now we do indeed translate political science in Aristotle's Ethics and his Politics from Episteme Politikon, but that is in the context of political philosophy. Knowledge of politics is knowledge of the human good because he conceives of the flourishing of a city as being a part of the flourishing of a human being, which is why when he talks about the different virtues, he includes things like liberality with money and stuff like that, because he essentializes the polis as being sort of akin to we are related to the polis as the bee is to the hive. Like, we wouldn't consider just the feeding of an individual wasp by itself, just lonely, not doing anything, as being the flourishing of the wasp. The flourishing of the wasp is its relationship to the flourishing of the hive, right? And that's how he conceives of humanity, as being similarly a political animal that is at his best when in a community a community of virtuous people in a context where the full range of virtues can be attained and practiced because the conditions of those virtues are there. And of course, he derives all of his virtues from sort of idealized political attitudes, essentially. So, or things that are, I should say, are idealized within an already existent political context. So, for example, courage in war requires a state to wage war, or more accurately, a polis to wage war. But it requires a state to wage war. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to be brave. You aren't brave when you're only protecting yourself in the wilderness. That's foolish. You protect yourself. Bravery to be, or courage to be a virtue, requires some sort of duty to make it the appropriate response. Modern political philosophy, by contrast, it assumes human being is a rational being because modern political philosophy takes place in the context of a vast array of disintegrations, and as well a lot of like critique of traditional authority and things like that. And so you have to root your state's legitimacy in something other than its antiquity or its genealogical right to rule. I should refer to the sovereign, not the state, to the sovereign's genealogical right to rule, so like the divine right of kings or something like that. You need to root it in something that holds the mass of mankind to its contract, to its that makes them beholden to the laws of the state. Because if all you have is a defunct traditionalism that is no longer believed, then you have no argument. Somebody who denies the authority of the sovereign, or like maybe he argues on the basis of his religious authority. He has been ordained by the church, therefore, and by the nobles, therefore he is the king. If somebody denies that, if somebody makes the argument, say, that, well, actually, you may say that you are ordained by the church, but in fact, I think what actually happened is you guys used brute force to assume this position in society, to fill the church with people who are your allies, and you've put on airs afterwards and have simply said that actually, no, God did this. But no, we think that actually you came to power through mere acquisition. You simply used the sword to take your place at the top of the community. If somebody says that, you can't just flat out deny them, because now you have a direct contest to your authority that denies the very basis of your claim to authority. So you have to root it in the will, ultimately, of the person who is making that challenge. And that's what Hobbes does. He locates the authority of the sovereign in the decision, ultimately, of the constantly renewed decision by the citizens individually to take part in a community in which they sacrifice some of their rights for the sake of their ultimate good. And so after Hobbes, that's more or less how we think politically. Because we just don't buy the stories told by archons or by popes or by kings that they rule because of mystical powers in the world that have placed them there, or because of laws in the world that cannot be demonstrated. So, I'm going to rewind this a little bit because I want to make sure that I'm actually giving him his fair due. So let's just see what he said here one more time.
State is not necessarily the kind of government, but that those in power have virtue. For Aristotle, if a monarch is virtuous, then monarchy is the best form of government. But he also asserts that tyranny, where the ruler is not virtuous, is the worst. Aristocracy is the next best, anarchy is the second worst if the few who do rule are not virtuous. Polity is the third best of the...
Okay, I've gone too far back. I think it's here.
Rational individual motivated only by his own material self-interest. This is an important insight because it's something that our modern political science seems incapable of understanding. Because the Enlightenment conception of man is that he's a rational individual motivated only by his own material self-interest. Therefore, the assumption is that a leader with great or even absolute power will necessarily use it to enrich himself at the expense of the public. The rationale behind liberal democracy is that it incentivizes government, which is comprised of self-interested individuals, to act in the public good by making them acquiescent to the citizenry, which is also comprised of self-interested individuals.
I mean, you will find arguments like that, but I think the general idea, rather, is that there is an intrinsic good in taking part in rule. This is the Enlightenment, of course, and this is a great revival of sort of classical political ideals. I think what he's falling into is he's still thinking in terms of sort of the top and the bottom, right? No, I don't want to phrase it that way. He's still thinking in terms of a sharp division between the ruler and the ruled, but in the context of democracy, power is seated in the people, divided and conceived of as the people, not as sort of the underlings of tribes or things like that, or as a slave population, but the people. If it's a strange thing to respond to, because he's talking about the failings of modern political science, but he's not really citing anybody. So I'm actually starting to doubt myself. Is he talking about the failings of modern political philosophy? Because modern political philosophy is largely dead. If he's talking about political science, these are internalist arguments for the legitimacy of sovereign rule within a state, but modern political science almost never is concerned with questions of sovereignty, really, because sovereignty, again, is a purely internally oriented thing. It doesn't actually have a concrete existence. It is simply the fact of arbitrary decision over a state. And it's a little bit difficult to locate in the modern world because there are no actual sharp divisions in terms of who has the ultimate decision within a certain geographic area in the modern world. We have, for example, sanctions that can pressure a state to make decisions, or for a government, rather, to make decisions in a territory that is not at all within the formal authority of the state that is issuing the sanctions. That can pressure them into changing their behaviors with respect to how they punish criminals, how they treat their own populations, things like that. So there's no clear way to actually locate sovereignty in the modern world or in a system of states. Modern political science is largely concerned with things like the dynamics between states. In terms of security or economy, in terms of forms of government and things like that, but it doesn't really talk so much about what is in the interest of the public, right? That would be more something along the lines of political philosophy, and there's very little engagement with that. Where you do find engagement with that is often in Marxist political theory or things like that. But Marx is almost post-political. He does what Machiavelli does, where he refers the powers that be not to any sort of regal history, but to processes. In Machiavelli's case, it is acquisition or inheritance. Marx attributes it to economy and technology. So, and I mean, eventually with Rousseau to the enclosing of land, but it's yeah, this is very indeterminate.
Self at the expense of the public. The rationale behind liberal democracy is that it incentivizes government, which is comprised of self-interested individuals, to act in the public good by making them acquiescent to the citizenry, which is also comprised of self-interested individuals. This is untrue. People aren't these rational beings who are only motivated by material gain. There are virtuous people who will act in the public good and non-virtuous people who will not. The most important thing for running a healthy society is that the leaders are virtuous. Now, using this framework, I want to examine liberal democracy as it actually exists and explain what's really wrong with it. Based on the Aristotelian classifications of regimes, the West today isn't a democracy. It's not a direct democracy, nor is it ruled by the masses through representative democracy. As explained earlier, public opinion has very little effect on policy. A direct democracy probably isn't even possible for any regime with a population much higher than 100,000. And even in regimes like this, a ruling elite will still emerge.
Okay, so here's a question. Why is he applying Aristotelian regime analysis to the modern world? Like, there are some clues here for why that's inappropriate. He needs to introduce the idea of representative democracy, which is obviously very post-Aristotle, because he's dealing with communities of a size and scale and of numbers that simply make what we call direct democracy non-viable. Now, I mean, direct democracy never really existed truly. It was always a minority of the citizens who actually got the decision at the end of the day. But, crucially, when we're talking about a community that is of a scale, that it can have representative democracy, or that it requires representative democracy, you are talking about something that is functionally distinct from a polis. The politeias that Aristotle is going through in the Politics are things that you can plug into a specific community form. It's questionable whether or not the state even is a community form. The state largely, especially in 20th century political science, is construed as an apparatus. Like, what is the state in Max Weber? The state is that which has a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical violence within a territory. What that tells you right off the bat is that the state isn't the community. The state is an entity which has these certain capacities and powers and purviews over a population or over a community. And it can exist quite apart from it. When we talk about the modern concept of sovereignty, we talk about that which can make decisions without the community's consent. Now, maybe they can do so by the community's consent, but ultimately, you give that thing a level of autonomy apart from the community such that it is a distinct thing. So, yeah. Sorry, what's that? Yushe Touche? May one send a functional Discord invite link? I will update the invite link afterwards. Nobody asked me for invite links in future. If you want an invite, just message me on Twitter. But what's basically happening is every time we try to make the Discord link work interminably, it just resets. I don't know why. It's probably something on our end, but yeah. Yeah, so in any case, like, it doesn't actually make sense to... no, I mean, there's one way in which you can fit an Aristotelian frame into the modern world, and that is, of course, you can characterize all states as inherently tyrannical. It is ultimately ruled by force. There is a distinction. Not all rule was rule by force. Rule may have been attained by force, but rule in ancient Athens, for example, prior to its democratization by the tyrants, was ultimately ruled by a set of traditional relationships. You became the head of a household by the religious passing down of the right from father to son, and then you elected head archons based on the same thing. So it's yeah, but like I will say I'm pleased that he's actually giving a semi-competent reading of Aristotle. I wasn't expecting that. I guess, reactionaries, they would probably have more regard for Aristotle than other people. He hasn't really gone into Rousseau all that much. He's disparaged the idea of the general will, but he didn't demonstrate really an understanding of it. I guess if you just don't respect Rousseau, you just don't really bother to try. But, yeah. Let's keep going.
Because all societies are governed by an elite. The modern West should be classified as an oligarchy. It is ruled by the rich. Unlike an aristocracy, the oligarchy is defined by wealth alone rather than virtue or nobility, and they rule solely for their own private interests rather than the public interest.
Okay, so this is kind of absurd. So Bill Gates, yeah. These people do not rule the United States. These are extremely wealthy people who could have a lot of power if they chose to exercise it competently towards a specifically political end, but these people do not rule in the United States. These people have been brought to, they have been made to obey modern states. They're just exceedingly rich, and arguably, especially in the case of Jeff Bezos, extremely corrupt magnates, but these people don't rule. These people don't rule states. Yeah. Like, it's just silly to regard this as a ruling elite. They are an economic elite, but they don't rule. So that's just wrong. Mark Zuckerberg does not rule or play a ruling part in any state on earth.
Or nobility, and they rule solely for their own private interests rather than the public interest. As the alt-hype video demonstrates, elected politicians act on the behalf of their wealthy donors rather than the voters, and policy is driven by elite interests rather than public interest. Liberal democracy not only allows the rich to control the government, it allows them to rule outside the purview of any constitution. Because private institutions like mass media, big tech, the universities, and corporations all assert enormous amounts of control over the populace with almost no constraints from the government, meaning the populace is beholden to the interests of those who own all the capital. Now, as I said, all regimes...
Okay, but that's not distinct from any other political community, right? So an oligarchy is specifically that those who can attain office and those who can vote are the rich. It doesn't mean that the rich don't have the capacity to exert a disproportionate amount of influence on government. Like, there are elements of oligarchy in the United States, to be sure. Like, it smacks of it in a lot of ways. There's definitely a differential in terms of access to office based upon riches. But it's not a condition of getting into office in any formal sense that one be rich. Now, in practical terms, it might be, but that's different. So in oligarchies are quite explicit, right? They determine who can vote who is a citizen. And of course, in Aristotle's terms, a citizen is someone who can hold offices and, of course, by definition, can vote. Who is a citizen is determined by certain monetary qualifications or certain qualifications of wealth. You have so much pasture at your disposal, or so many sheep, or whatever, or you have so much gold, or you have so much cash. That is an oligarchy. An oligarchy is not when you have a state of affairs where technically anybody can hold office, but only the rich at this moment have the capacity to effectively run. You might argue that's a de facto oligarchy in a sense, but it's really not, because again, like the thing that's holding people, that's preventing non-rich people from getting into office or from influencing it, is a temporary state of affairs that isn't directly embedded in the Constitution itself. Like, it's sort of like if we had a situation where, like, let's say COVID got really, really bad, and then suddenly only rich people, for the most part, were well enough because they were distanced in order to spend time engaging in politics, right? That wouldn't therefore be an oligarchy. It would just be the fact that right now, the average person, there is a correlation between wealth and political activity. But the crucial thing is that in an oligarchy, wealth causes or allows political activity.
Regimes are ruled by an elite who will naturally be wealthy. The problem is that by destroying monarchies and aristocracies, liberalism creates a purely financial elite. The elites are just as wealthy as any king or aristocrats, if not more, but their rule is not grounded in any kind of tradition which binds them to the wider society they govern. So they don't really have any interest in the long-term health of society because they don't derive any kind of prestige from its success or lose any from its failure. Over the past 6 decades, the elites have literally facilitated the physical replacement of the native populations of the Western world, along with their entire culture.
Right, so when he's talking about the core population, he just means white people. So, I don't want to, like, dig this into the ground too much, but, or I guess beat it into the ground. The fact of extraordinary wealth does not, of itself, make a state oligarchical. And I don't know, it's a very strange argument that the king, because he is placed in power, or the monarch, in his endeavors terms, because the monarch is placed in power by right of tradition or religion or what have you, that therefore he is more beholden. Like, definitionally, a monarch is not responsible, right? He can't be voted out. He doesn't lose the monarchy when he fails. He only loses the monarchy if he fails so terribly that the people rise up and destroy the state. I don't know. Yeah, it's... Direct democracy in the modern USA would be a mess. Yeah, anyways. Let's play a game. Let's see, we're at 13 minutes in. How long does it take him to start talking about the Jews?
Religion and heritage. Why? Because the elites care not for nation, God, or civilization. They are rootless cosmopolitans who care only for wealth and power. If dissolving an ancient civilization makes the GDP go up, they'll do it. In addition, there's a very large portion of them who are an alien elite, loyal to an alien people. Since liberalism removes all barriers...
Wow, that didn't take long, did it? Wow, how auspicious is that? We went to the JQ in the span of 2 minutes. Actually, that was seconds, that wasn't minutes. Unbelievable. Yeah, let's keep going.
To entry into the ruling elite other than wealth. A hostile group can enter the elite and network to shape the society in their own group's interest, at the expense of the interest of the common good of the native people. Furthermore, liberal...
Okay, so again, he's talking about the common good, but then he says of the native people. The reason why we talk about the common good is because in the political community, we have equal priority between different tribes within the community. That is to say that tribal affiliation is politically meaningless. The common good is specifically the good of the community as a whole, not the good especially of our favorite members of the community. So what he's arguing effectively, or what he seems to be arguing, is that the common good is bunk because it's not ethnically prejudiced? Like, that's preposterous. Again, belonging in a community is a function of being able and willing to, and in practice, of course, be in the act of doing so, of partaking of the community and getting its benefits, and fulfilling the obligations that it puts on you in exchange. If a community allows somebody to become a citizen, it has willed that person to become a citizen. Anyways.
Democracy allows the elites to completely abdicate any responsibility for their failure to provide for the public good. Elected politicians spend a decade or two acting on behalf of their rich donors, then just retire with a pension, and whatever mess they left behind is no longer their responsibility. The state of the West today is the result of decades of disastrous policy, but no one has ever once been held truly accountable for this disaster. Decade after decade, the politicians have just dumped the problem onto the next generation, making it worse and worse. The oligarchy's front of democracy is nefarious because it gives the populace the illusion that they are in control of the power structure of their society when this couldn't be further from the truth. So they never push for systemic change. What recourse does the system allow the populace to take against the elites? Absolutely none.
Well, because again, a modern state is not structured around the idea of one class of people attacking another one. I think Endeavor really wants to, you want to look to Marx for a justification on those grounds. If he wants to say that the modern state is inherently tyrannical, I have no argument. But if he wants to say it's tyrannical because it doesn't permit effectively politically targeting sectors within the community as unequal and undesirable subjects of extermination, effectively, or to punish them, that's preposterous. That is, in fact, of a kind with precisely the kinds of tyrannical activities that initially gave us democracy, oddly enough. This is just silly. The definition of the public good is not that it serves... The definition of the common good or the public good is that it serves the public or the commonality. Definitionally. He's saying it's a lie because it doesn't serve white people at the expense of black people.
Now I want to look at monarchy in contrast to the oligarchical system which liberal democracy creates. I need to make it clear that I don't really see monarchy as an achievable political goal anytime soon, but that's not the point. I want to look at the benefits of monarchy and what insight understanding them can give us. When I say monarchy, I mean a regime in which the monarch actually exercises some degree of political power. They don't just act as a figurehead. Countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden, or Spain are not monarchies. These are liberal regimes. First, I want to dismiss a bad argument for monarchy, which...
Okay, so that's a little bit confusing. So, he is sort of right that Canada and the UK are not, in fact, monarchical, but he's wrong when he says that liberal equals the opposite of monarchy. A liberal regime is not necessarily one with a specific kind of government. A liberal regime is one in which there is a sharp distinction between private and public right, because public right is derived from the private, again, as in Hobbes and as in Locke. Those who rule are legitimated by the fact that you tacitly accept their rule by individually enjoying the goods of their rule. This is one of the reasons why, by the way, why liberalism is, why it's so important that you're allowed to cross borders in liberalism because you can't consent if you can't choose your sovereign, right? So you can have a liberal monarchy. All that means is that the ultimate decision, the sovereign power, is held by one person who rules by dint of, occupies that position. That would be a monarchy. There were capitalist monarchies. There were liberal capitalist monarchies. France before the Revolution was capitalist, and a lot of nobles partook in capitalism. So these just aren't distinct. Now, of course, there's a lot of correlation. Places with monarchies in power typically do so because they are heavily traditional, and that will sort of dampen the surface level effects of liberalism. But these aren't fundamentally distinct from each other. Liberalism refers to a different level of the structure of the state.
Which has been made by several thinkers of the right before. The idea that monarchy creates better material incentives for the monarch than politicians. This is...
So, Yushe Touche asks, wouldn't the British Empire be considered a liberal monarchy? No, I don't think so. I think I mean, it's tricky because practically the royal family has no actual power. So I don't think I would consider it to be a liberal monarchy. But it was at one point. There was a monarchy with a parliament where citizens had rights against the monarch. There was a distinction between public and private right, things like that. So it was mercantilism in a sense for France before the Revolution. Sort of. So, hang on. Sorry, I want to make sure I'm not BSing this. Yeah, mercantilism isn't an opposite of, is not a distinct thing from capitalism in the sense that they're mutually exclusive, right? Mercantilism has to do with, it's more of an, it's an attitude to deploying capitalism imperially, if that makes sense. So they aren't really distinct. Capitalism has to do with relationships of employment, and you can absolutely have contractual employment with mercantilism going on.
This is the argument used by several NRX writers like Mencius Moldbug or Nick Land. Moldbug advocated neo-cameralism, where a society would be governed by a kind of CEO who would govern like running a corporation. Nick Land's argument for monarchy is that the king's kingdom is like his own private property, while a democracy is a politician's public property. The argument is that the king has interest in his own property, while the politician does not. The problem is that this argument still operates under the liberal Enlightenment assumption that man is a rational creature and that he only responds to his own individual material incentives.
If man is not a rational creature, then what is he arguing this for? Like, he's doing it badly, but he is specifically trying to appeal to our rational judgment that monarchy is preferable. He's not saying that monarchy is right because God said it's right. He's saying monarchy is good because it's in our interest. Let me reason you to this. He's operating within a thoroughly Enlightenment mode. He's just against the aesthetic.
The argument is that by giving power to a few rather than the masses, those in power are incentivized to pursue the public good. But this misses the real nature of monarchy or traditional aristocracy. It fails to understand, as the Greeks understood, the fundamental difference between an illegitimate tyranny and a legitimate monarchy.
This was not understood by the Greeks. This was understood by the Greek nobility, specifically the Athenian nobility. That is not the Greeks as a whole. The Athenian nobility had a vested interest in only the Athenian nobility being able to control the state. So, obviously, within the culture of the elite citizenry, because of course the citizens were an elite class then, within that culture, character traits that made one optimal for engagement in that culture, optimally suited for engagement in that culture, were eventually sort of deified as virtues. Liberal, again, like the naturalization of the state implies that healthy that activities and behaviors that are specifically conducive to the longevity and the survivability and the wealth of the state are valorized as being a part of the human good. So liberality with money, are you generous with your wealth so you don't hoard it? You like put cash towards the state's good, the public good, if you will, or are you a miser who holds on to it and sits on it, so that you, as an entity within the state, are not really, in the final analysis, a net good in terms of your existence there. Like you are not a contributor to, in Aristotle's terms, the human good, right? But again, like fundamentally, this is a self-defeating argument. He's trying to appeal to our rationality, to say that we are not rational. Now, I think what he means by that is, well, I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to implicitly argue that because in the final analysis, human beings are emotional and sort of passion, and we're driven by things other than our rationality as well, and these can really overwhelm us. That therefore we need a power that is incorruptible by our own drives and our own passions and our own hungers and wants, etc., to keep us on the straight and narrow. And there's sort of an argument there, except that is achievable in the case of, well, I mean, that's achievable in any of these alternative regime types that he's given us, because all you need then is some kind of persistent, because again, like the individual in their passions and whatnot doesn't simply have full power over the constitution of the state or over its decisions. There are, like, we collectively pool our powers together to hold us all in check against each other. Oh, someone's asked me a question. Wonderful asks, why should, as Hobbes would argue, humanity as violent, greedy, and selfish, would you ever want a monarchy who is just as susceptible to human nature, according to Hobbes' views? There are reasons why you would want a monarchy, and Endeavor sort of hinted at them here. So, there is no guarantee that the decision, that the general will actually conduces in the end to the common good. Like, there is a point there. The problem is that he construes the common good as being the good of a preferred ethnic group within the community, within the political community, and that's not what the common good refers to. That's a really complicated topic. There is no. It again, like it depends on what are the goods that you value. A Democrat might value, as well as sort of the long-term stability and I guess structural stillness of the state, or its wealth, or things like that. They might also value partaking in politics as an actualization of human agency, and that's good and important too, right? Now, if you count that as a good equivalent to things like wealth or stability or what have you, then you might be willing to take the risk of the mass of humanity, or I guess the totality of the citizenry, or the totality of a state's subjects. You might be willing to risk them making bad determinations now and then. And of course, monarchs can also make bad determinations. Revolutions happen because monarchs make bad determinations. So, anyways, let's let him continue.
A CEO and a monarch are not the same thing, even if they are both the one man on the top. A monarch has interests in the long-term health of his society which go far beyond his own personal wealth. First, I want to point out that monarchy seems to be the human norm anthropologically. Up until the last century, the vast majority of regimes in history were monarchies. And this is in civilizations that evolved separate from each other. Monarchy appeared in all of them. Of course, there were exceptions such as the Roman Republic or ancient Athens, but these exceptions were quite rare. Now you might say that this isn't necessarily...
What he's sort of identifying is that historically, ultimately, the decision of a community is singular, right? When a community makes a decision, that is a single event, and it is performed ultimately by a single movement. That movement either takes place in the personal decision of a single monarch or in the decision of a community as a whole. And that can be in the context of like a democracy where you have the citizenry votes and the most popular vote ends up being the decision of the community or things like that. Again, like... I mean, to say that monarchy is simply perpetual in history is just false. Like, it's just flat out false. Monarchy was a thing that emerged fairly late. Even in places like, even imperial powers, they weren't monarchical because it wasn't a single archon. It was specifically a ruler by, not a ruler by religious right, but a ruler by religion. Like the Persian king wasn't a monarch. He was a deity. That was his relationship to his community. Smaller tribes, like pre-political tribes, often had multiple poles of authority within communities. Now, of course, when they made a decision, that decision was singular. You have to make choices, like where are you going to hunt, where are you going to settle, what are we going to do in case such and such a thing happens. Democracies date back to the very beginning of our species. No, democracies do not date back to the very beginning of our species. It's confusing because we tend to associate democracy today just with the involvement of multiple people in the deliberative process of what a group does. But democracy doesn't refer to the involvement of many people in a decision. Democracy refers to the constitution of those people as they're making that decision. So that power is seated specifically in these arbitrarily, and this is important, specifically arbitrarily delineated groups. I'm going to do a video on the history of democracy at some point in the near future because it's interesting and important and people don't pay attention to it. But that power, again, is seated within these arbitrarily delineated groups and not in masses of people who are under the sway of tribal affiliations or familial affiliations, if that makes sense. I'm just gonna grab some water. I will be right back. So just hang tight for like 5 seconds. Hello, I'm back. Sorry, I'm starting to talk really fast because the pollen levels here are ridiculous. It's like breathing in sand. British Columbia is a beautiful place, but the fauna, or the local flora, wants to kill me. All right, let's keep going with this.
Necessarily an argument for the benefit of monarchy, but it seems that human societies naturally develop into this form of power structure. I've always wondered, was monarchy selected for as a Darwinian strategy? I'd certainly like someone who's much more versed than me on anthropology to look into this.
No, monarchy was not selected for... Okay, so there's a quote that I really like. Actually, I think I have the book right to hand. so I can attribute it properly. Where is it? It's a really good one. Yes, here we are. So, Ortega Gasset exclaimed, "Man has no nature, what he has is history." So, even when we're talking about prehistorical communities, when we talk about sort of like the way in which humanity sort of exploded and populated all of the continents within a very short order of time, too fast to be explained by reference to evolution. We are talking ultimately about the decisions of peoples to move out and to settle. We aren't talking about, for example, the habits of certain primates to occupy a small area and just subsist on stuff within a certain like small region. We're talking about people who made a decision to break out into the unknown and to effectively constitute communities where communities had not been constituted before. Decisions. Pragmatic decisions. Community forms were established by dint of who got there first, the interests of who got there first to maintain their position. They were established by they were established again by not in Darwinian terms at all. They were established rationally, sometimes cruelly, but always rationally. It's extremely inappropriate to refer to political institutions. And this is one of the major problems with things like evolutionary psychology, for instance, in that it tries to understand the history of historically contingent things in terms of survival factors that would only matter, or I guess in terms of postulated survival benefits in a state of nature. But they're definitionally outside of the state of nature. So, Seven Hake asks, when are you going to be doing the 5 to 10 minutes break that you were thinking about doing in one of your earlier streams? Do you guys want a 5-minute break? I mean, we're almost in the final stretch, so it doesn't really seem like a sensible thing to do, but what you described earlier in relation to the way decisions were made within tribes sounds more like aristocracy. How so? Aristocracy is ruled by basically sub-kings, ultimately. It's ruled by people who have a familial right to a specific rank in a community. That doesn't make sense. Aristocracy, again, is ruled by the best or the first in the sense of the nobles. Not conceived of as the best in terms of virtue, but conceived of as the best in terms of bloodlines, things like that. We don't have a concept of that until fairly late in our history. Alright, let's keep going.
So we'll have to put that theory aside for now. What is the number one innate human tendency that disproves that man is a rational, self-interested individual? It is that humans have an innate care for posterity, just like every mammalian species. Because this is needed for the species to survive, obviously.
Okay, but that's a rational reason. We have an innate care for the future of our species, obviously. But that's not irrational, that's entirely rational. Is he arguing that the existence of interests in the well-being of our species makes us irrational? I guess you could say that it's irrational in the sense that we sort of, again, like he's equivocating between innateness and irrationality. I think that's the point. But rationality doesn't necessarily mean that we think ourselves to it. Rationality just means that it's derived from it means that there's reason intrinsic to it. It means that we're not doing so arbitrarily. We care about things on the basis of coherent principles that exist within us. I mean, obviously, at some point we don't have like total creative control over what we prefer and how we experience the world, but that doesn't make us irrational. That sets the bounds of rationality, but that doesn't make us irrational at all. Like, for example, we can decide, as he is perfectly, as he would absolutely point out, we can decide to not care about posterity. We can decide to continue to care about posterity. We can rationally determine to care about some posterity and not other posterity.
Sacrifices a parent makes for their child are completely altruistic on the individual level. The individual doesn't gain from this materially at all. Instead, children are meant to make the same sacrifices when they themselves have children of their own.
Yeah, but we don't gain materially from things like philosophy either. People give away their entire lives doing the quintessentially rational activity with no... I mean, if anything, it probably hurts your prospects of reproducing in a lot of cases. So he's equivocating between rationality and materialism, I think. Not materialism in the Marxist sense, but like, the vulgar sense. Rationality is simply cold calculating, I'm just out to get the cash kind of thing. Who wants to bet Endeavor would call Indians savages? Oh, he absolutely would, and he has. So...
What monarchy does is apply this dynamic to political leadership. A monarch rules not only for their own interests, but also for the interests of their posterity. Unlike a financial oligarch who has no connection to the society they rule over beyond their ability to extract wealth from it, a monarch is inseparably tied to the land and people which they rule over.
Monarchies are inherently modern and extremely rationalistic. Like, extremely rationalistic. Europe for a long time was not ruled by monarchs. It was ruled, again, like when you think about feudalism, you are not talking about a situation in which a monarch rules. A monarch rules in a modern state. It is super modern. And by the way, the Ancien Regime in France did not regard itself as archaic or traditionalist. It was modern. Frederick the Great's regime was modern. These were people who were extremely interested in new technologies and new forms of organization even, and new ways of thinking. Like these were modern communities. Monarchy is very modern.
The health and stability of this must be maintained beyond the monarch's own life if they wish to pass this on to the next generation and continue their dynasty. And as I mentioned, it is the most basic of natural human tendencies to want this. Though a monarch is wealthy, they also derive great prestige from the flourishment of society, something financial oligarchs and their politicians who rule over liberal societies do not. Unlike elected politicians who...
I mean, they do, though. Like, these people became wealthy because of it, right? Anyways.
Simply serve the interests of the rich for a few years, then leave office, never having to take responsibility for their actions, a monarch is held responsible. First of all, the people aren't deceived into thinking they have power when they don't. They know who is ruling over them, and if the monarch fails to uphold order, the people know who to blame.
Yeah, but they have no power, so what are they going to do? Like... in the event where a monarch fails and continues to fail, and the people blame the monarch because the aura of mystique around the monarch has dissolved, and he's laid bare as basically just a great criminal ruler, what are they going to do? They're going to revolt, potentially, and dissolve the entire state. That's terrible. That's a bad situation. You don't want the only recourse to be the destruction of the entire community of the structure. like if Donald Trump fails, like in the case of COVID, he gets voted out, somebody else gets voted in, and policies change. Executive orders are signed and stuff is addressed. If the King of France failed and people were starving, they had a choice: continue to starve or revolt and take the food. This isn't complicated endeavor. Let's keep going.
We have the misconception today that if a monarch does a terrible job, they can't be removed from office. This is incorrect. Monarchs can fall, and throughout history, bad monarchs have. A monarch that fails to uphold order loses not only their own throne, but loses it for their posterity as well.
Okay, but again, like a monarchy, a monarchy upholding order, you're talking about a monarch at war with the population. It's not a balancing act where you're like just trying to like simmer a pot at just the right level so it doesn't bubble over. Well, maybe that's an okay analogy, I guess, in terms of what you would consider like a good performance in office. But like again, if like let's think about this for a second. What is he saying? Well, there are examples of monarchs falling. What happens is they fail to uphold order and then they lose their kingdoms. Okay. So what he's basically saying is that monarchy is inherently unstable because it rests upon the competence of one man, whether or not the entire state is dissolved. That's terrible. And of course, this is borne out because there's a reason why there are no genuine monarchies anymore. This is a preposterous argument. What is he arguing? That the form of community in modernity, or the form of regime in modernity that has historically fallen the most, is the most stable? Like, here's a question for you. Name one monarchy that hasn't fallen, or hasn't had its power taken from it, or hasn't been neutered and turned into a mere figurehead because the society would collapse otherwise. It's like we have the current regime forms that we do rather than monarchies specifically because they were put together to address massive deficiencies that resulted from monarchy.
And sometimes they lose their head. It's much easier to remove one monarch than to remove an entire international financial elite from power. So the monarch is actually more beholden to the people.
Okay, but an international financial elite. I can't tell if he means the Jews or if he just means like huge capitalist magnates like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. He could mean both. Oh my god. Okay, so again, financial elites aren't financial elite is not a form of sovereign power. It's not a form of government. He's complaining about the existence of great moneyed interests that can sort of corrupt the decision-making apparatus of different communities, and that's true, but that's not solved by monarchy. Monarchs had that too. Like, monarchical decisions can just as easily be corrupted by offerings of exorbitant wealth from outside forces. There is no guarantee against that in a monarchy. None whatsoever. Nobles can be corrupted. In France, prior to the Revolution, nobles were technically not allowed to engage in mercantilism or capitalism or whatever, yet some did. Like...
As for the issue of divisions of power, much like with direct democracy, a state beyond the size of a small city couldn't possibly be governed by one person. A monarch does share their powers, usually with a nobility or some kind of aristocracy. There's numerous levels to the hierarchy. It's not simply one person ruling over everyone else. The monarch's power is shared with aristocrats who similarly are tied to the land and people which they rule over and have the same vested interest in prestige and posterity. As for rule of the best, People raised in noble families are most likely to be the best fit to rule. They are raised by their families for that exact purpose and have the most resources available to help them develop into that role.
Okay, but that's literally just justifying inequality by saying that, hey, there's inequality. It's like, should we give poor people the resources to to inform themselves and to have sort of like the leisure time to be competent members of a political community? No, they're not fit to, because the rich already have those. Like, this is preposterous.
Now, I need to stress again that monarchs and aristocrats who rule over traditional regimes aren't really any richer than the financial elites who rule over liberal regimes.
They're actually much less rich, but in any case.
The difference is that the monarch has very important symbolic value for the society they govern, which the businessman or politician does not. There are plenty beloved monarchs throughout history. There are very few democratically elected politicians to ever reach such status. In the last century, has there been any politician in the liberal West to reach the status of a Charlemagne, Alfred the Great, or Louis IX? Simple answer is no. Let's consider the Palace of Versailles in France. You can point out that it's excessive, but it truly is a wondrous cultural achievement. It was built by the old French monarchy, but today it remains a symbol of national pride for France, centuries after its construction. Millions of people travel to visit the Palace of Versailles every year. The question of whether or not tourism is a good thing I will put aside. What this does show is that the Palace of Versailles is awe-inspiring. It's an example of the value of monarchy as a cultural institution. Centuries from now, will anyone feel awe-inspired by Jeff Bezos' house and travel across the world to see it? No, Jeff Bezos is a soulless cosmopolitan with no connection to America beyond the money that he can extract from it.
Finally, something we agree on.
The only thing his house will ever inspire is the selfish pursuit of money. You also have to compare monarchy and liberal democracy on a civilizational level. Sure, there were examples of bad monarchs and suffering under their rule, but over the course of history, the institution of monarchy has offered stability. In contrast, the idea of liberal democracy is about 3 centuries old, but the current universalist egalitarian iteration only came about around a century ago, and only became the norm following World War II.
Okay, so there's a few things to unpack here quickly. I mean, the obvious point is that the existence of awesome architecture is not an argument for monarchy. Egypt was ruled by massive slave owners. They had more impressive structures than the Palace of Versailles. It's, I guess, in terms of scale. Like, this is a... Like, what is the argument here? Monarchy good because they make big buildings off the backs of the people they oppress? This is a terrible, terrible argument. The fact that France now has, France is now able to profit from tourism towards these historical sites, that doesn't attest to the greatness of Versailles, or the greatness of monarchical France. That attests to the fact that monarchical France died and is now a relic of the past because it was unstable. Like, it is... Like, here's... Okay, how about this? Nobody right now would even think about visiting Jeff Bezos' house. I mean, they're kind of cool, but nobody would think of, like, spending money to tour Jeff Bezos' house because it has no cultural significance. But I guarantee you, if Jeff Bezos was responsible for some massive state-destroying catastrophe, his house would then become a site of interest. Isn't Endeavor a fascist? Endeavor is a neo-reactionary, I guess you could vaguely call him alt-right or something like that, but he's a neo-reactionary, not a fascist. Well, he's probably de facto a fascist and he doesn't realize it. No, he's not a fascist. I want to be more careful about that. So, fascism entails specific attitudes towards technology and sort of the matching of human will and strength with technology and economic and natural forces, right? That's why it's obsessed with things like eugenics and stuff like that. and why like its art depicts like images of insane human strength and a lot of movement and the sort, and why they were so well connected in the early parts, at least, of Italian fascism with futurists and people who were interested in the expansion of mankind, both in terms of longevity and power and in terms of travel, stuff like that. It's in a context it's way more dangerous, obviously. One of the reasons why a lot of futurists became disillusioned with fascism in Italy was because fascism in Italy started to become reactionary. They started to exhibit the kinds of argumentation that you're seeing here. That is to say, not so much concerned with maximizing human power and greatness and speed and force, but more concerned with protecting like a cultural heritage and sort of closing in, that kind of thing. But yeah, so beautiful architecture does not commend a form of government. If anything, in a state of affairs where a large part of the population is suffering or starving or otherwise deprived, and there are new, gigantic, expensive buildings being built that are only for the benefit of the monarch and the nobles, that's a sign of a bad form of rule. And then, again, the fact that these things are visited constantly is a testament to the fact that they are no longer functional buildings in the sense they once were. These are no longer like sacred spaces for the nobility and the monarch. These are now, in a very serious sense, dead relics of a dead regime. So, also the Nazis cared about strength, that is true, but the Nazis threw away technology at times because it was Jewish science. I don't know that history particularly well, but I wouldn't be surprised. I didn't say they were smart. But in any case,
we need to remember that long-term societal health is more important than short-term individualistic prosperity. Sure, the past century might...
Okay, but short-term individualistic prosperity is a condition of people in a society being invested in that society's future. If individuals are suffering because of the nature of their community, they are not going to therefore invest in the prolonging of that specific state of affairs.
Might have been economically prosperous, but that prosperity is already in steep decline. Much like if how a person spent a year not working, eating and drinking whatever they wanted, not exercising, and racking up debt on parties, vacations, and consumer goods. They might enjoy themselves for a short period of time, but that's hardly the way to live a long, healthy, and fulfilling life. In the same respect, sacrificing future civilizational health and stability for short-term material prosperity is not a virtuous way to rule. These are the benefits of traditional authority structures like monarchy or aristocracy in contrast to the modern liberal democratic system. However, I don't believe that it's possible to implement them anytime soon. They were based upon long-established traditions which no longer exist and can't simply be created out of nothing. However, I believe that there's value in looking at the benefits that these systems provided and applying it to the world today. So what is the real takeaway from all of this? What do stable societal orders have which liberal democracy does not?
Okay, so again, like, liberal democracies are by this point far more stable and far more prosperous and far stronger than any monarchy has ever been. And our increase in wealth and power and stability has been correlated with the decline of monarchy. So, if there's an argument for monarchy, it formalizes the location of the decision in a state of emergency, or I guess that's sort of being redundant. It formalizes, it stabilizes the location of the decision in case a situation comes up in which a decision is needed. Democracy has the disadvantage of being slow and of having strong resistance to arbitrary decision-making in the face of catastrophe. Ironically enough, an example of this is that earlier in this video, Endeavor referred to the COVID scam, reflecting his unwillingness again, like ironically enough, his unwillingness to go along with the ordinances of the structural authorities or of the political authorities, because he, enlightened Democrat that he is, believes more in his personal freedom than in the well-being of his community at large. So, yeah, this isn't it, man.
The answer is skin in the game. That is the key to all of this. Skin in the game. Do the people governing society have a vested interest in serving the public good by maintaining the long-term societal health beyond their own lifetimes or not? Are they loyal to the people whom they govern? And will they be held accountable for their actions? These are the questions which matter. This is how you know who will serve the public good and who will not. That needs to be the basis for whatever power structure is to replace liberal democracy in the future. That power is given to those with skin in the game.
Okay, so here's a question for Endeavour. What does he think the Parliament in England was made for? Like, have monarchs historically ever acted primarily toward the common good or the public good? Like, obviously not. Again, like, following on the revolutions of late modernity, you see a huge explosion of, or I should rather say, a massive decline in poverty and inequality. Huge strides in terms of mass education. Like, everybody reads now. Everybody, like, we have, like, our primary issue at the moment is that our food is of extraordinarily low quality, and that's why we have an obesity crisis. People aren't starving. Everybody has the capacity to become immediately informed of what's going on in the world. We have the freedom to go where we please without someone telling us, no, you are tied to this land. Like, it's never been better. And ironically enough, like, even in terms of, like, the kinds of goods that Endeavour would value, like classical music, painting, like these high tier, difficult, artistic and philosophical and what have you, these endeavors, we've never had more of them at once than we do now, because so many people are getting educated and being given the opportunity to spend time to do them. Like, there's a reason why there are so few political commentators that actually come down to us from monarchical societies, because people weren't doing that great. People weren't being educated. People weren't being fed so they had time to be educated. Like, everything he's advising here, everything he's extolling here is a virtue of monarchy, with the sole exception of his apparent understanding that. Actually, I totally forgot. Why am I not even talking about this? He's talking about skin in the game of the monarchy. I cannot believe I didn't catch on to that. Guess who the nobles and the monarch identified with in France? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't with the French people. They thought they were a Germanic race of conquerors who ruled by dint of having conquered the slave population of France in time immemorial. And when the revolution happened, they took off to Germany with their kin. And of course, all throughout the periods in which monarchies were the norm, they were intermarrying with each other and not with the common people. They had no skin in the game. None. They were an international elite that had no lasting interest except for whatever they could take from it in the well-being of the communities in which they ruled. So, like, No endeavor. This is preposterous. Monarchs do not have more skin in the game than elected people who have a direct one-to-one relationship between their office and public approval.
This can take several different forms. I've already shown this for monarchy, but what are some other forms? One aspect of this historically has been religion, that those who are entrusted with the reins of power must swear on the altar of God that they will rule justly. Monarchs in the past have seen themselves as having a divine right to rule, hence God will hold them accountable. Another example of this is that there were some states in America which made it illegal for atheists to hold public office because they couldn't be trusted if they didn't have a religious conscience. In postmodernity, when nothing is held as sacred, we're taught to believe that religion was cynical and only a means of control. But historically, this wasn't the case. There were many rulers who truly did believe that God was going to hold them accountable.
He just gave an example of democratically elected officials having the exact same religious limitations on their activities as a monarch would. And of course, monarchs weren't actually restrained by religion. Think of the foundation of the Church of England, for God's sake. He wasn't restrained by the Catholic Church. He just made his own.
Accountable, and they were better leaders as a result. Another way to ensure that the rulers have skin in the game is that they must be of the same tribe as those they rule. In the ancient Greek city-states, citizenship and political power was limited to those of native birth. Even ancient Athens was a democracy for a period of time, but it wasn't a liberal democracy. Athens was an ethno-state. Only men of Athenian birth who belonged to specific tribes, which wasn't the entire population, were allowed to participate in the democracy.
No, so that's not true. So, yes, citizenship was inherited, but when Athens was democratized, again, what specifically happened was the old tribal affiliations were broken up, people were sorted out into demois, and there were now material conditions to involvement in Athenian politics, which included birth. But citizenship could be awarded sometimes to outsiders who were perceived to have rendered a service to the state. So that's not true. Athens was not an ethno-state. Now, it was probably fairly ethnically homogenous, all things considered, just because of how small it was, and because that's again you're dealing with a much smaller community and much smaller degrees of intercultural and interstate and intercommunity exchange and things like that. We of course don't have airplanes that people can just choose on a whim to spend a few $1,000 and migrate to a different country or a different city. But no, Athens was not an ethno-state, not at all. Even before its democratization, Athens was an alliance of tribes. Not an ethno-state at all, not one bit. That's simply wrong. Leaving aside the fact they didn't conceive of themselves as a state, I'm calling Athens and ancient Greek Polii as a state for just because that's a whole other question as distinguishing the state form from the polis form, and it's just easier to say state, all other things being equal. But there was no conception of these are actually contradictory. Athens could not have been an ethno-state because its identity as a polis being put front and center over its identity as an alliance of tribes was directly predicated on the breaking up of those tribes into demois so that the mass of the voting population identified more with the community as a whole and with their subdivision within the community than with their tribes. They had a political identity, the first political identity. They literally identified with the polis. There were no ethno-states back then. Even, in fact, when you look at what he might call examples of monarchies, but really despotism, when you look at the Persian king, that was a massively diverse structure. There were, people didn't have access to the decisions of the empire as a whole, obviously, but the Persian king took in myriad peoples and armies and their technologies under his wing. And in fact, it's a common occurrence in Athenian history, where a great ruler will be disgraced and he'll flee to avoid execution. And where will he go? He will go to become an advisor or a refugee under the Persian king. So, yeah.
Because they were the ones with an ethnic connection to Athens, hence skin in the game. I do agree with Aristotle and Plato's criticisms of Athenian democracy. It was a bad system for the time, but even then, they understood the importance of skin in the game.
Plato and Aristotle thought that democracy was a bad system at the time because as a result of Athens' growing power following on the Persian War, the community got a head full of steam, really under the direction of generals. Not so much the community itself, but they got a head full of steam with all of their power, and they decided to try and consolidate their power and grow by using the connections that they had developed with other cities, in the Delian League, like exacting tribute and things like that. And they got hubristic and overextended their power and ended up being under the thumb of Sparta. So, like, there again, like, Athenian democracy was very good for Athens. The problem was that it lacked an effective mechanism for moderating itself. So, again, like, democracy refers to the seat of power, not to the decision-making apparatus. You can have a democratic monarchy. That is actually possible. You can have a monarch who derives their power from the undifferentiated mass of the citizenry or of his subjects. The reason why Athens lost control over its, the reason why Athens lost itself, if you will, was because there was nothing in place to stop it from just doing whatever someone in the assembly convinced everybody else in the assembly to do in the moment. It wasn't a matter of direct democracy. It was a question of, like, again, just like there was no breakup of decision-making authority within the polis, such that any party could say, like, actually, guys, like, we have limits. Like, there's a thing that we are not allowed to do because of the constitution of our community. Or, however, we have this body of experts who have the authority to say whether or not this is a viable decision or whether or not this is within the law, like things like that. So, but like, there was a de facto. Actually, this is perfect. So you look on the screen here.
My favorite.
You see Pericles here. So Thucydides attributes the fall of Athens to the loss of Pericles, who was ambitious but had a carefully reasoned strategy of sort of like a cautious expansion and a very defense-oriented expansion, where of course he builds the long walls, and he has Athens become a sea power state, so that it recognizes itself as being primarily dependent on its trade by sea for its power, and it focuses primarily onto protecting the sources of its power and making sure that it can survive any attack from Sparta. What ends up happening, though, is they do really well, and then in the Peloponnesian War, and then they decide to go overboard, and they start they assemble like a massive fleet, and they go to invade Sicily, and they lose their fleet. They lose their entire army, and then the Spartans move in and take Athens. It wasn't an internal instability. It's that Athens made really stupid decisions. So, So you know that even under feudal systems, people could read and engage in debate with people they didn't agree with? Yeah, of course they could. But not a lot of people. Right? Like, that's the whole reason why it was such a big deal that the Bible was translated into common language.
Videos I've made was on an interesting historical occurrence which took place under Athenian democracy. Any just and virtuous system of government will account for skin in the game. While I like the idea of monarchy, I'm not particularly ideological about what system exists in the future. What I care about is, do the elites who end up in charge have skin in the game or not? And I would support any form of government that ensured that the elites were loyal to us, they had a vested interest in long-term stability, and that they could be held accountable for their actions.
Which he means the elites are white. That's basically it.
What exactly that will look like will be determined by future circumstances. It could be a completely new form of government that exists in the future. I have an open mind in this regard. A great way to look at this is through Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction.
Oh no, not Carl Schmitt. Actually, I have been noticing a lot of these people in these spheres, like Keith Woods, the academic agent. I think even the Distributist was reading political theology a little while ago. There's a sudden interest in Carl Schmitt in particular, which is strange to me, because Carl Schmitt is not really that amenable, ultimately, especially in the books that they tend to cite, like political theology, concept of the political. I don't know if Nomos of the Earth is a slog. I mean, it's extremely worth it, but it's a long, slow book. But it's not actually amenable to a reactionary stance. Like, there are reasons why political reaction is actually... do I want to go down that road? Let's hear what he has to say first, and I'll save it for then.
In his essay, The Concept of the Political, Schmitt said that all politics can be reduced to the struggle between different groups with conflicting interests. Friends are those who are loyal to a group's interests, while enemies are those who are hostile to that group's interests. Those who have skin in the game, who have a vested interest in the survival of European civilization, are our friends.
Okay, so this is a mistaken understanding of the concept of the political. So Schmitt is trying to identify what is the political qua the political, and what he happens on is that the political seems to be at its most intense when there is a firm distinction between two sides in a contention, between a friend and an enemy. He has been contested on these grounds. If you read Agamben, for example, he will point out that, well, actually, one of the major distinctions between the political and the non-political refers to the distinction between the internal of the polis and the deserts beyond, right? So what distinguishes the polis from outside the polis isn't a friend-enemy distinction necessarily. I mean, that's sort of implied by the fact that there's walls in place. Of course, that which goes against the walls is the enemy. But for most of the time, the distinction between the political and the non-political isn't the absence of a friend-enemy distinction. It's the absence of a human environment in which any sort of contention can take place, in which any sort of mutual deliberation takes place. The friend-enemy distinction is only the political is only at its most intense when there is a firm friend-enemy distinction. Or rather, when there is a strong friend-enemy distinction, that is where you can most clearly identify the political. He's viewing this rather statically, however, because this works within the context of, like, agonistic politics within a democracy. So the political takes place when you have different parties contending with each other over a certain decision or a certain policy or something, and there are friends and enemies within that context. In the context of warring states, the friend-enemy distinction can be traced along like front lines in a war. But that's just where it's at its most intense. That's not definitionally the concept of the political. And one's appropriateness, or the appropriateness of a certain form of rule, is not dictated necessarily by one's level of intensity with respect to that. Like, for example, you could have a political community on an island with no other states around. the appropriateness of one ruling that community would not be that they're hell bent on the preservation of their society against the outside, because there is no outside. So again, like, Schmitt is trying to identify the concept of the political itself, not the concept of government, not the concept of good government or good rule or justice. He's trying to identify what the political is. And something is most obviously political when a friend-enemy distinction has been concretized around it. That's a really important word for Schmitt, is concrete. He's really interested in what solidly is in politics, or in human affairs generally. But yeah, like, skin in the game. You don't determine your friend and your enemy racially. Well, that's not entirely true. You can determine your enemy racially. So, for example, if you have one tribe that attempts to exterminate another tribe, then you would have a friend-enemy distinction fall along racial lines. But when you have communities living otherwise peaceably together, regardless of any problems that are introduced either by cultural frictions or because, I don't know, for whatever reason, the arrival of some group en masse results in some sort of imbalance that needs to get sort of sorted out, whether that's in terms of a sudden, like, population explosion requiring more policing, or requiring more food or more space, like, whatever. Like, I mean, there are logistical things that can be taken seriously about, like, immigration and whatnot. That doesn't mean that, therefore, the brown people in a community are the enemies of the white people, and that all the white people are friends with each other and all the brown people are friends with each other. The political can exist in multiple different places at once, and there's nothing about that distinction that necessarily makes them enemies or friends. Like, there's nothing intrinsic about looking like, or even having cultural similarities with members of a group that puts one in common cause in a political contention with people in a different group. I don't know where he gets this idea that people of different skin tones are locked into an eternal war with each other. Like, we're not different species. This is ridiculous. Like, even in the context of Europe, there's a huge diversity of different lineages there. Of different races, quote-unquote, as the term was understood a long time ago. Again, like, for God's sake, the French aristocracy identified itself as being of a different race from the French commonality. That was how they identified as being a part of the aristocracy. It was through a distinct bloodline. Would Endeavour argue that they were therefore definitionally the enemies of France? I mean, of course, that does seem to be the consensus ultimately. They fled to Germany and went to war with France, so...
Those who have no vested interest or who are outright hostile to that goal are our enemies. Schmitt attacked liberalism for its denial of the friend-enemy distinction in pursuit of a universalist good. He claimed that this does not eliminate the struggle between friend and enemy, but simply neutralizes the interest of whomever buys into this universalist delusion, putting them at the mercy of those who understand the friend-enemy distinction.
And here's what's kind of funny about that. He was arguing this in a context where the unwillingness of the Weimar government to lay down the law and say, actually, yeah, sure, we're a nice liberal society, but this thing will not be born. He was arguing effectively for the Weimar government to go harder on the Nazis. White nationalists would have been exterminated in Weimar had it heeded Carl Schmitt's advice. And Schmitt knew this, so it's like...
This is what liberal democracy has done to people of European descent in the West. It has removed all barriers to holding positions of power in Western society other than wealth under the guise of universalist egalitarianism. It has neutralized the legitimacy...
Hang on, I need to hear that again. Let's go back like a couple seconds.
What liberal democracy has done to people of European descent in the West. It has removed all barriers to holding positions of power in Western society other than wealth under the guise of universalist egalitarianism. It has neutralized the legitimacy of the group interests of different European descended peoples and opened the door to a group of people who do understand the friend-enemy distinction to reorient Western society to serve their own group interests.
No, I think most people move into Europe and into America so they can make money and have a prosperous life, because a lot of other countries don't have a lot of the social benefits and the social infrastructure and all these things that make us live really easily. Like, this is just a thing he asserts. Like, he just thinks that all brown people are out to get us. This is so weird. Like, why does he think this? Like, I have colleagues that meet the description of the barbarian hordes that he's referring to here. They don't resemble this. They just want to get a job and, like, raise their families and, you know, do the stuff they want to do. It's generally only really, really poor and downtrodden and oppressed people, or people who have been violently abused or dispossessed, that get into that kind of mode where they start engaging in things like terrorist action and whatnot. This is... I don't know. There's just like, there's a weird undercurrent of spite here that is just not... a spite for people who aren't actually implicated by any of this. Anyways.
They consciously promote those of their own group to positions of power because they know that's who's going to be loyal to their interests.
Well, no, I mean, one of the reasons why, like, for example, people like Jagmeet Singh are celebrated, that's in Canada, by the way, he's a Sikh politician, or Barack Obama, or what have you, is that in the context of North American and a lot of European history, these groups were treated as unequal to the rest of the population, so it's a serious development that therefore now they, like anybody else in the community, can hold office as citizens. They're not like... there's not some concerted effort by Sikhs or brown people or Chinese people or whatever to take over the government and exterminate the whiteys. I don't know where he's getting this from.
Their skin is in their game. In addition, they'll ally and promote members of other groups who don't have the interest in the continued health of our civilization, while actively removing from power those who do. This is why affirmative action or so-called diversity policies exist. It's to remove anyone who is loyal to the group interests of white European people from positions of power, and to promote those who are hostile to our interests.
How is having a bunch of the... How is having massive populations of your citizenry left to rot in perpetual poverty to the benefit of your community? Like, let's just... leaving aside the ridiculous idea that giving bursaries to black kids to go to university is somehow empowering insurgent elements to rise up and take over and push white people out. Like, how is the opposite of that good for us? Like, this is... like, no. That's obviously absurd. And affirmative action, again, is specifically targeted to reduce poverty. Reducing poverty that is endemic to specific populations. The reason why it targets specific populations is because it targets specific populations based on serious demographic correlations between population and wealth disparity. Like, which can be this is so stupid. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, it's annoying. Like, when you're scrolling through, like, scholarship opportunities or what have you, and you're seeing, like, this is for members of the First Nations or whatever they say, or what have you. Like, it's annoying. But, like, that's not taking something from me. I don't know. Affirmative action is just to avail opportunities to brown people. All the diversity supreme stuff is a far right straw. I assume you mean a far right straw man by AA, not a far right straw man of AA. Affirmative action has unintended consequences. Like what? People are in order to minimally prosper, you need to be able to be educated to a point where you can become useful. In order to become educated to a point where you can become useful, you need to be in a minimally prosperous situation such that you have time and are not, like, surrounded by toxic elements, such that you can learn, right? If a community is suffering from widespread poverty, or if a demographic is suffering from widespread poverty, regardless of the reasons, they will not get themselves out by themselves, pending some, like they just won't. Like, poverty perpetuates itself. See the result of the Texas Law Program? Let's look at that. Texas Law Program. Can you be more specific? What is the U of Texas Law Program? Yeah. Oh no, that's yeah. I'm getting links to their law department. Let's see. Affirmative action. Affirmative action case. Okay. Here we go. I'm assuming this is Hopwood versus Texas you're referring to? Alright. 1996 was the first legal challenge to the university's affirmative action policy in student admissions since Regents of the University of California versus Baca. In Hopwood, 4 white plaintiffs who had been rejected from University of Texas at Austin School of Law challenged the institution's admissions policy on equal protection grounds and prevailed. After 7 years as a precedent in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, the Hopwood decision was abrogated. Okay, so what was the case? After being rejected by the University of Texas School of Law in 1992, Hopwood filed a federal lawsuit against the university on September 29, 1992. Was denied admission to the law school despite being better qualified than many admitted minority candidates. Okay, so here's the catch. This is, again... Okay, so I see what you're saying. So here's the problem. First of all, like, the decision of the court doesn't necessarily inaugurate this as being a valid situation in which an actual injustice was taking place. That is, it is a decision ultimately made by people with their own prejudices, what have you. Leaving that aside, so in this particular case, Hopwood was suing the school on the grounds that despite having better qualifications than many added minority candidates, she was denied access. So earlier in this stream, I was talking about how Endeavor was using the fact of inequality to justify inequality. As I was just saying seconds ago, a condition of being able to prosper is that one has a minimum degree of wealth and access. That includes, by the way, success in public school. If you are undernourished and you are overworked and you are... Oh, this is not what you're talking about? Well, I'll finish talking about this anyways. If you are undernourished and overworked and you are surrounded by toxic people who, by dint of being undernourished and overworked, haven't developed an appreciation for things like things like education or science or whatever, or stuff that one can do to elevate themselves, or to get oneself out of poverty, then you are going to perform badly because you are not going to be conditioned by your environment to take school seriously. And even if you do try really hard, you're going to have a lot more working against you than somebody who is not in that situation. So while, yeah, this person was denied on the grounds that spots were taken up by people with technically lower qualifications, they may have been getting those qualifications under vastly more difficult circumstances, right? Like, we just don't know. Now, what often does happen, of course, is that, because, of course, like, we're blind in both cases. Like, we don't know if somebody was necessarily in a harsher situation, or maybe they just happen to fit the description of people who are disproportionately in a harsher situation. I mean, there are non-white people who coast through university who don't really deserve to be there. That is a thing that happens. But that's beside the point. That's like a separate issue. That means we need to like be more scrutinizing of like income and whatnot, and measure that against performance and things like that. But in this particular case, like if the grounds is simply that minority candidates were allowed in and then slots were filled, and therefore an overperforming white person who applied was that doesn't seem fair to me. That seems to be to assume that I don't think in a situation where disparities in conditions are rampant, the bare fact of better qualifications does not necessarily commend one candidate over another. We need to be a bit more nuanced about that. But anyways, George Lipscomb, you were saying that this was different. No, this is the same one. At the U of Texas, they admitted more Latinos and blacks into the law school, and a lion's share of them flunked out. Well, I mean, that's unfortunate. But what's the argument here? Like, what are you saying exactly? I would give the qualification to tiebreakers to the poor. Well, I mean, qualification tiebreakers, like, maybe the disparity is huge. Like, for example, I'm white, but I come from a lower income background. And despite taking my education a lot more seriously than most of my colleagues, I had a huge degree of trouble. Well, I mean, I actually haven't gotten into a degree past my bachelor's for that reason, because my grades aren't fantastic. Because one of the things you need to do in order to get good grades is you need to be able to sit down for long periods of time and do nothing but your schoolwork. But I was working up to 40 hours a week and traveling like 4 hours a day when I was going to school. So, like, when was that going to happen? Well, it was going to happen when I'm car sick on the bus, or late at night instead of sleep. That all those things are going to affect performance. Like if you're a kid and your parents are both working, and you're eating cheap, crappy food, and you're taking the school bus, and you're like, there's so many different things that can cause somebody to fail other than lacking merit, is the point. However, that being said, like, obviously affirmative action can be performed really poorly, and I think that it is important that they take a more fine-grained approach to it, because I don't think somebody, by dint simply of being non-white, should be allowed in over a non-white person. But you shouldn't necessarily discount somebody because their qualifications or their because their qualifications are lower. Because that, like I guarantee you, if I was running against an Olympic athlete who had like heavy weights tied around his ankles, I could probably outrun him. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. No, we'll see. I'm not going to do that. But like, you know what I mean. They flunked out to a much higher degree than the other students. I mean, fine, but like, same situation, right? Like, they didn't become rich because they went to college. They may have needed even more support. Like, Like, think about what happens when you graduate from high school and you go into university. Are you suddenly wealthier? Do you suddenly have more financial support? Not necessarily. Often what it actually means is that actually you now have a ton of expenses associated with college that you didn't before, and now you have impediments to working. Now you have to balance work and an immensely more difficult workload in school. Like, I'm not surprised that they flunked out to a much higher degree. If the like, you know who you know what demographic doesn't flunk out to a very high degree despite being rife with low merit, generally speaking, is rich kids. Being able to spend multiple hours in the day just chilling and doing your homework and doing extracurricular activities so you can generate more and more credentials, that is much more helpful in terms of success in university than being really, really smart or really, really good at something. If you are burdened with, like, if you're burdened with full or even like part-time work and having to travel from poor areas of the city to get to university, that's going to be, like, I can't stress enough, that is a huge burden. And I had it relatively easy. So, like, I don't know. And I mean, like, again, like, I think that, I think the solution, honestly, is that there should be additionally more, maybe affirmative action is sort of a loaded term in this case, but there should be more support for poor students generally, as well as for students in demographics that have been subject to historical oppression or historical prejudice or what have you. Like, people forget it wasn't long ago that black people couldn't even vote, right? Or segregation. Like, these are recent things. These are really recent things. You don't think it's the responsibility of the university to solve inequality, though? Well, why the hell not? If we're talking about civic responsibility here, skin in the game, inequality is extremely deleterious to social cohesion and to social well-being generally. We absolutely do have a responsibility to help alleviate things that are deleterious to our social health. I'll be right back. I need some water. The pollen is killing me today. Okay, sorry about that. Coughing up a storm here. Yeah, no, I think the universities do have a responsibility to, at the very least, alleviate to the extent that they can unjust inequality that results in, first of all, human misery and social strife. We absolutely do have a responsibility, and the university does too. They also have a responsibility to try and do it well, though, and I think a lot of people do it cynically. So that's a fair critique. But yeah, I'm gonna have to wrap this up soon. I don't think I'm gonna be able to talk for much longer. Let's finish this off.
It's the friend and the enemy. And this is how we need to start looking at this. We need to get out of this rationalist, individualistic, incentive-based understanding of how the public good can be best served, and get rid of the idea that the public good is universalist.
It's kind of a ghoulish image he has for this, isn't it? It's like people hunting with dogs.
Start seeing it as a friend-enemy conflict. We want our friends to have as much power as possible, and our enemies to have as little power as possible. Because our friends are the ones who have skin in the game. That needs to be the basis for any parallel institutions going forward and whatever system is created in the future. And seeing as we are up against a decentralized international financial elite who rule through mass indoctrination, cultural deprivation, and economic blackmail, they can only be stopped by a political entity using the force of the state against them in our favor. That cannot be done through liberalism.
Okay, so yeah, somebody asked if Endeavor was a fascist. Yes, he is. It's basically what he's advocating for here. That's unambiguous at this point.
Ultimately, the problem with liberal democracy is that it doesn't hold leaders accountable. The goal of any polity is to uphold the long-term health and stability of the core group which it is founded on. To do that, it must be ruled by the most virtuous, who are loyal to those who they rule and have a vested interest in achieving this goal. The key to this is skin in the game, and that's how you best serve the public good.
Okay, so that's wrong, and we've gone over ad nauseum why that's wrong. But I guess in sum, before we close off, Endeavor misconstrues the public good as being the prospering of his pet group. He conceives of ethnic groups as being more politically coherent than, oddly enough, the communities of actual states, or the populations of actual states, of citizens. And he thinks that we need to take this kind of Darwinian species-level antagonism between racial groups all the way up to how we constitute our governments. And that's absurd. President Sunday, how do you explain the success of Northeast Asians who come from poor backgrounds? I'm not really required to. I'm sure there are reasons. I mean, off the top of my head, I think a really rigid culture of working super hard early on probably helps things, but I don't see how that's really material to the question. Like, nobody's denying that there are cultural elements in terms of success, right? Like some poor people are culturally, shall we say, they are culturally conditioned to excel more under bad conditions like these, or specific conditions like these, than other cultures are, or than other sort of cultural clusters. But a part of that too is that the waves were treated as current conditions emerged over time, and the sort of the cultural configurations that resulted therefrom are different between these groups. Like, again, like, let's say we're talking about black people in America. The poverty experienced by black people in America is going to be different than the poverty experienced by white people in America, for the simple reason that there were additional things going on besides poverty. It wasn't just the case that prior to desegregation that they were just poor like anybody else was. They were also poor and not allowed to go to university. Like, that's a big factor. Culture doesn't come out of the ether, it draws upon a biological substrate. No, it's preposterous. Culture is an assemblage of pragmatic responses to our environment. Even as far back as the population of the globe by human beings, the initial, like, the move, the crossing of the Bering Strait to America, the expansion into Europe, things like that. Not expansion into Europe, I think we actually came from Europe. But, like, again, like, we're taught culture doesn't develop in a state of nature. Like, I'm sorry. Even if we're talking about, like, Western civilization or something, like, there's nothing intrinsic to our biology about that. The number of people who have framed that is tiny, and often were, like, despised and persecuted in their time. Like, the life of Socrates is hugely influential on the progress of the disparate things that we sort of colloquially group under the West. But he was hated by his peers, and he recognized, even among like people who were practically related to him, that ultimately, like, your qualities as a human being were the result of education more than anything else. So no, like, the idea that culture is determined by biology is preposterous. Now, cultures pragmatically evolved to address biological needs, but but like, there's nothing about being white or black or whatever other color you like that makes somebody make a better bowl, or makes somebody happen upon democracy and therefore wider access to wider involvement in political interests, and therefore widespread education and an interest in philosophy and things like that. Like, these have no relationship whatsoever with ethnicity. Like, none. Like, none at all. That's just preposterous. And furthermore, I don't know where on earth you're getting that from. Like, culture draws upon a biological substrate. What are you basing that off of? Like, let's talk about, like, for example, the often touted IQ disparities between ethnic groups in the United States. All these tell you, is that right now there are on average disparities in terms of how well people of different ethnic descriptions do on a test. It doesn't tell you anything about why. Even if you control for things like affluence or things like that, there are so many elements that we are just, and this is, by the way, all assuming that it's that IQ tests unproblematically actually measure intelligence, right? Like, that's disputed. Jordan Peterson is very wrong when he says we can just measure intelligence easily. We actually can't. But even assuming that we could, they tell us absolutely nothing about the conditions that actually produce those outcomes. So, like, this is silly. And we have no historical precedent whatsoever for a society succeeding based, or a community developing a high society of merit based upon its racial makeup. Like, that's ridiculous. It is always entirely to do with a combination of wealth and institutional structures. Those are crucial. Funny that Endeavor is living just fine, but no pretty buildings means fascism must rise. Yeah, basically. I mean, like, these people are freer. Like, these people are easily construed as enemies of their own states, right? Like, these are people who foment the idea that we should overturn the current regime, remove rights from certain people, vastly restrict the rights of citizens, and they're perfectly allowed to do so. They're allowed to have their little groups. They're, like, within reason. They have to abide by certain minimal norms of civility. But they're allowed to exist. A monarchy would have exterminated them, and justly so, on their own metric. So, yeah. Anyways, my throat is going, so I've gotta stop. But thank you, Endeavor, for this educational video. All right. You all have a good night. Thank you for joining me, and do take care. Goodbye now.